Greetings. Let's get right into it. We are here to talk about Payscale Index and wage growth for the second quarter of 2021. Why is this important? Well, wages are rising. We actually haven't seen this much wage growth in quite a while, especially in certain occupations and sectors. The market is so volatile that a lot of employers are having a hard time attracting candidates to their job openings right now. And when they do attract candidates, they're having a hard time pricing their jobs accurately and are often experiencing rejections from candidates on those offers. At the same time, currently employed workers are looking at this market and thinking, I don't know, maybe I should see what's out there. And so there's a lot of dissatisfied people right now when they're looking at the market thinking, what are my opportunities? Should I be looking around for other work? Especially folks that have had a difficult year due to COVID-19. The opportunity is pretty wide open right now for change, which means that turnover is on the rise and expected to be even more egregious in the future. All of this points to 2021 being one of the most important salary budget planning seasons that we've had in quite a while. And so with me today, we have Jackson Gruber, a data analyst with Payscale, who is intimately acquainted with our crowdsourced salary data and builds out our Payscale Index report every quarter. So I want to ask him some questions about the Payscale Index within his area of expertise, take a look at wage growth in Q2 and what the most recent report is saying and what it means. It launched on July 13th, so you can check that out at payscale.com. So Jackson, let's start at the beginning. What is Payscale Index?
So before we talk about the index, I want to briefly touch on the crowdsourced data that we use to create the index. And this is data that's generated from the salary profiles created from our salary survey on Payscale's website. And that's a great resource for anyone to use to get a free salary report from us to evaluate their job and their compensation. And when we collect all those profiles, we'll get up to hundreds of thousands each quarter. It actually allows us to evaluate some great trends, hopefully great trends in the labor force and the economy across different sectors of the economy. And so with the Payscale Index, we essentially are doing something similar to how we might think about the Consumer Price Index, which is how we track the value of goods over time. And so, for example, we might look at a loaf of bread in 2006 and see, okay, how much did this loaf of bread cost? And then we look at that same loaf of bread today and see how that cost has changed with the US dollar. And so that's essentially what we're doing with the Payscale Index, but we're doing it with jobs and with wages. And where that gets tricky is there's a lot that goes into compensation. You have years of experience, you have educational background, skill set, employer size, industry, all sorts of variables that can affect pay. And so the beauty of Payscale's data is that we are able to create a compensation model with all of these rich data sets that we collect through the survey. And that allows us to evaluate how each variable impacts pay and allows us to control how a job's value can change over time. So for example, instead of a loaf of bread, we would look at an accountant between 2006 and 2021. But that accountant has maybe different years of experience in one year and then different experience levels in another year. And so that can get complicated really quickly when you're trying to isolate the value, how a value of a job changes over time. We just want an accountant with 3 years of experience in 2006, and an accountant with 3 years of experience in 2021, and look at how that value has changed over time. So that's what we're able to do with the compensation model. And that's what the index provides. And so when we look at growth over all sorts of different job titles between two time periods, we can take that aggregated growth that we observe, and that average growth is the Payscale Index.
Wow, okay. So I know that if I go to the index on payscale.com's website, it will show two different types of wage growth. It will show nominal wage growth and real wage growth. Can you explain the difference between the two graphs?
Yes, absolutely. The nominal wage growth is wage growth that hasn't been adjusted for inflation. And so what we've observed since the beginning of the Payscale Index is that nominal wages have steadily increased more or less at different rates, but they've increased. But when we adjust for inflation, which is what real wage growth is, we see that real wage growth has actually fallen. And what that means is the purchasing power of a salary in 2006 was actually higher than what it is today. Despite the fact that nominal wages have increased, up to this quarter, it's been 19% increase in growth, which we'll get into in a second. But despite that increase of 19%, we actually are seeing that the salaries of 2006 are still worth more than they are today. The real wages have declined 9%.
Okay, and we're talking about average wages too. So everyone's salary in aggregate, as an average, it's worth less today than it was in 2006. And to use your loaf of bread example, the nominal increase of a loaf of bread goes up over time with inflation. But when we look at wages, we have to consider what the purchasing power of that wages compared historically to a moment in time, which in this case is 2006 for Payscale.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and we use 2006 as a baseline. One, because it's just a great perspective to have, as it happened right before that 2008-2009 recession. And that allows us to have a reality check of where was wage growth at before all those cascading impacts of the 2009 recession, and how has wage growth looked since then. And we actually have seen that wage growth has been impacted for a long time, even up to today, since that last recession.
Yeah, it makes sense to look at it now, I think, in particular, because we've just gone through another recession. So we can compare the impact of that 2008 recession and wage growth during that period to what is happening right now. And that might give insights to both individuals negotiating salaries as well as employers trying to set salaries for what is happening in the labor market in that kind of aggregate view.
Yes. Yeah. When in 2006, 2007, when we started the Payscale Index, or not started, but we started looking at it, when the data starts, I should say, the rate of wage growth is quite steep if you plot it out. And then when the recession happens in 2008, we see a more or less decline in wage growth. And so that obviously hinders that steep rate, and the curve starts to flatten. And that flattened growth never really recovered to the high rate that we saw in 2006 and 2007. And it's actually this quarter that we're seeing some equivalent rates in nominal wage growth that we were seeing before the 2008 recession. So that's really interesting.
Okay, so you're saying right before the recession, we saw wage growth similar to what we're seeing now. And then we saw flattened wage growth for 10 years. And now it's starting to grow again.
Yeah, and flattened is a strong word to apply for that long of a time period. However, while it was flattened around that 2008 and into maybe 2011, it did steadily increase nominally for a while up to last year, 2019 or so. But we're starting to see that steep growth rate again.
Okay.
Right now.
Accelerating now as this year of COVID has changed so much. in the labor market, and especially as the economy recovers.
Right.
Okay. So tell me about what's happening in Q2. What are the highlights kind of overall for wage growth? What's interesting about index this quarter?
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. And this is why I love the index, because it always aligns well with the trends that we might expect to see in the economy based on events going on in the world. And so for Q2, like I was saying earlier, since 2006, there has been a 19% increase in wages overall, nominally overall. And now, one thing to point out is inflation is up again because the exchange of goods has increased as the economy has reopened. And so with that increase in exchange of goods, we're going to see inflation rise again. And with inflation rising, that actually is detrimental to real wage growth, as we were talking about earlier. And so real wage growth is taking a steeper decline than it has in the last year, because in the last year during the recession, we had the economy shut down and there was less of exchange of goods going on. And so that caused deflation. So the decline in real wage growth that we've been observing since 2006 in the index actually flattened for a while there during the pandemic because of deflation, which was a good thing, more or less. And so now we're seeing, as we see ourselves come out of this pandemic recession, we're seeing inflation rise, and therefore real wage is going to start declining more steeply again.
Interesting. Okay, so what has been the nominal wage growth this quarter and over the past few quarters that's been different from before?
Right. So quarterly growth at the nominal level was, I believe, 2.6%, which is high, high compared to, not even just last year, but the last few years, even decade that we've been doing the index. We did see wage growth, nominal wage growth, continue throughout the recession of the pandemic, but it wasn't as high on a quarterly basis as 2.6%. And I think we did continue to see nominal wage growth during that recession because, the composition of the workforce had changed so significantly. You had a sector who, was facing disproportionate amounts of layoffs, which would be hourly workers, more what we might say blue collar workers, who, were facing high unemployment rates. They were lower paid workers. So what happens to the equation when you remove lower paid workers? Well, the average goes up. Those people who can stay in their jobs are relatively high with their job security and high paying workers, tech workers, for example. They enabled that growth rate to continue throughout the recession because their sector of the economy was pretty resilient to the pandemic.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think it actually be more accurate to say that they were allowed to retain those higher paid workers throughout the pandemic. I'm not actually sure how long economists are going to say the recession itself lasted. I've heard various things, and one of the things I've heard is that the recession technically only lasted for a couple of months. So like from that April to June period that all the layoffs happened, that was the recession. And since then, we've still been a pandemic, which has kept unemployment high and perhaps contributed to that wage inflation, but may historically not be viewed as a recession, although it is atypical. So I don't know yet how economists are going to call that. I'm not sure if you've heard differently or the same.
Yeah, I would agree with you. There is, of course, a technical definition for a recession, which don't ask me to define.
I'm not an economist either, so I don't know.
But, of course, there's always something to be said when the economy is shut down, recession or not. How does that impact the workforce?
Yeah, definitely a pandemic driven economy, which is not something that we have a lot of historical data to analyze and compare for wage growth. But that's really interesting that wages, so they've been increasing over the quarter over quarter for the past few quarters, but in this most recent quarter, there's been a show of acceleration. Just to summarize what you said.
That's right. Yep.
Where is it accelerating the most? Like for which occupations or industries are we seeing the highest increases?
Yeah, so this is one of those areas where we find that the index really aligns with what's going on in the world and the economy. The top job occupational areas that showed strong wage growth this quarter were, travel, transportation, food services and restaurant jobs, and retail. And all three of those are, of course, now on this recovery track post-pandemic. Jobs are increasing in those areas, employment is increasing in those areas, and now we're seeing wage growth increase in those areas.
Yeah, I think food services in particular is the one that's going to surge back because restaurants were so heavily impacted by COVID. And then I would suspect that transportation and retail have been decently high. We were talking about warehousing and delivery services as part of transportation, maybe less so for airlines and actual travel that folks are doing during the pandemic. But that makes a lot of sense, I think, from what we've been seeing at a market level, and particularly with the surging of desired goods as businesses start opening again, and there's so much demand for the things that we've been kept from for the past year. So that makes a lot of sense to me. What about cities? Are we seeing anything interesting at the metro level when it comes to wage growth?
Yeah, absolutely. Normally what we see in the index are for the top metros are Seattle, San Francisco, strong tech economies. Mm-hmm. And we saw that in the pandemic because those economies are really resilient, like we were just talking about.
Right.
This quarter, however, we have seen Tampa, Florida, leading the charge. And Tampa, of course, has a strong hospitality industry, strong in accommodation and food services. And so, what we're seeing there are the impacts of a response by employers to bring in more hourly workers in these economies with that are just hot metros in general for travel and accommodation. Austin and Raleigh are also in the top three. These, I just found out, were ranked high, very high in the top best places to live as of this month. And I think Raleigh was actually number 2. And so, I think these are hot metros. I mean, Austin's economy has been booming for a long time. I'm not surprised that any of these are in the top 3 right now.
Yeah, I think what's interesting to me is how far Seattle, San Jose, and San Francisco have fallen, because like you said, they were in the top, 1 to 5 quarter over quarter for years. And as a result of the pandemic and all of the news we've been hearing about remote work being permanent, possibly for a lot of tech companies, people are, I don't know if I'd say fleeing those cities, but certainly evaluating their options. And some of those options might be Raleigh and Austin. Like you mentioned, where you can still be part of a growing tech center, but with the lower, somewhat lower real estate pricing than San Francisco or San Jose. So we don't have enough data to really be sure that that's what's going on, but it's an interesting change in economy to witness, and interesting, I think, to see how remote work is going to change, best cities to live in, where people will live in 10 years versus where they're living now. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch.
Right.
Okay. Do we have any predictions for what's going to happen with wage growth? Do we, we don't have a crystal ball. Are we able to kind of make any guesses or hunches for whether or not this wage growth is going to continue into the next year or two, or if it's going to kind of like hump and go back down, maybe the way it did in the last recession. What do you think?
Yeah, I do see nominal wages continuing to rise. Probably not as of a steep rate as it's been this quarter, but I think going into the next few quarters, I wouldn't be surprised if we kept at this rate for a while. But I do think it'll slow down eventually and stabilize to something a little more sustainable. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you may not have an opinion on this, but we've been hearing a lot, or I've been hearing a lot, that rising wages are a sign of a labor shortage. And my cat's making a guest appearance in our video. But the labor shortage concept, I think, has also to do with the unemployment rate, which doesn't collaborate or corroborate with rising wages for explaining why it is difficult to get workers to come on back to their jobs. Do you have any perspective on that? Any thoughts based on what the wage data is showing us, and how that may or may not be telling a story around labor shortages?
Yeah, absolutely. So, normally when we see wage growth in the index, it's associated with a competitive talent market. You have a small pool of viable candidates to choose from. And so to get them in the door and get them hired into your business, you have to shine them a pretty penny and entice them in the door. But the difference there is it's a small pool of willing candidates. And today what we're seeing is high wage growth in response to a large pool of less than eager candidates. So there's the subtle difference there. So, whenever we see wages rising, that is almost always, unless it's due to some regulation, an effect of an increase in demand for labor. And so what indicates this quarter or this data as being a result of a labor shortage is that it's an increase in wages alongside a relatively high unemployment rate. The unemployment rate right now is around 6%, which, while much lower than last year at the height of the pandemic, is still well above levels prior to the pandemic. And so what we can take from that is we have a lot of people in the workforce who are not employed, who could technically fill these job areas that are fairly low barrier, but they aren't. And so because of that, we have to, we being employers have to increase wages to entice workers to fill those roles.
Yeah, I think it is more than just increasing wages too. I think that's part of the puzzle, but I think that the pandemic experience caused a lot of soul searching and reflecting for a lot of people in what their life was worth, and what their time was worth, and what their what their skills and expertise was worth to an employer based on how they're treated, how rewarding the job is. And I mean rewarding in all ways, not just how much you're compensated. So I think a lot of employers right now are kind of going back to the drawing board and figuring out, why should people want to work for our company? What do we stand for? What can we offer in terms of a total work experience, total rewards, all the things that make a job worth doing. And I think that that's having a higher impact on lower wage jobs than it has done historically. I think that those conversations have always kind of existed for that upper tier level of workers, but it's now trickling down to those essential workers who for a year have heard were essential, and now maybe want the experience to match that label. In addition to other things, that the pandemic is not over. Our vaccination rates are not 100%. We still have variants of the of the disease like spreading in certain areas of the country. I think childcare is still an issue for a lot of people, and there are I think other things that are allowing folks to take their time. Unemployment benefits being one. I know that's been put out a lot in the news, but I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's a lot of things that are impacting people's choices when it comes to where am I going to get a job and when am I going to get a job. So I think people will come back to work. I think the urgency around that is not as high as employers would like it to be, because they've been unemployed for a year at this point. And I think they're taking their time, they're evaluating their options, and the best thing employers can do is to really think about what the full job experience is like, and to try to make that full experience as attractive as possible. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think the pandemic really led to the right conditions to bring us to where we're at right now. Essentially, the pandemic created two very divided sectors of the workforce. You had a sector of haves and a sector of have-nots, in a sense. A sector that could work from home, had pretty high job security, had great benefits, and there was no risk to their personal health to perform their job. And then you have the complete opposite of that with hourly workers, essential workers in various sectors of the economy during the pandemic. And so, the workforce really observed that one, American companies, we've guaranteed that American companies can build in a remote work process into their business. That is proven at this point. And so there is demand for that now among the workforce. And I think there are sectors of the workforce that got a taste of very high job insecurity with very little payoff. And now they're looking for something better. No surprise there. So yeah, employers have to respond in kind.
Yeah. So what do you think that this means for salary budget planning and determining like the pay increase cycle for this next cycle? And I'll give you an example of what I'm thinking here. I think for employers, there's been kind of an inertia of the pay increase cycle sits around 3% for the average worker for increasing wages. I think this year is and should be different for a variety of reasons. I think that businesses that did not give wage increases last year because of the situation they were in are going to face expectations of correcting that imbalance in this next year, especially if the business was more profitable now versus before. Obviously, there are going to be some revenue constraints for certain companies. And then I also think that we have rising inflation, which theoretically means that those increases need to account for that inflation in addition to merit on top of that. So I don't know what that means at an individual company level, but it seems to me that the increase cycle for this year should be higher than it has been in previous years in the market that we're in now for business that can afford to do that. But wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment wholeheartedly. I think we're already seeing turnover increases in the economy right now. If you look at the breakdown of the unemployed people in the workforce, a higher and higher percentage of them over the last few months have been voluntary job leavers.
Yeah.
And so, turnover is increasing, which means we have to respond in a way that gives employees, something more than what they had before all of the crises they faced in the last year. And higher wages is, of course, the best way to do that. And I do agree that we have to finally take into account the inflation rate and not constantly be pushing that cost onto our employees. and pushing the cost of inflation into people's paychecks. That's just not sustainable for an economy to withstand. So we do have to account for inflation. And I do think that there will be higher expectations among the workforce to see that tepid wage growth from the last year and prior years to finally turn around and start increasing more substantially.
Okay, so final question, I think, for today's little session on the Payscale Index in Q2. How can crowdsourced data from Payscale help employers with their salary budget planning, with trying to figure out what should those increases be by occupation or industry? What tools exist within that data set? And we do have other data sets, but within that data set to help employers make these determinations during this difficult time.
Yeah, so I think, like we've been talking about, the power of the crowdsourced data and what the Payscale Index shows and continues to show consistently quarter over quarter is that it's really responsive to the labor force, and the ability to have fresh data where you can identify these trends is invaluable to responding to the kind of level of economic turmoil that we've had in the last year. So though that fresh data, the ability to break down the data by specific metros, skill sets, any variable that affects compensation, it's a good chance that the crowdsourced data has it and that it can be used to identify patrons for those specific variables. So it's highly valuable.
And I'll just share with the audience, for those of you who are not familiar with Payscale's suite of products, if you are someone who does not have a subscription to any Payscale software, you can purchase salary profiles from payscale.com. We have like a low tier e-commerce product that allows you to bundle jobs together. We also have a suite of products that are mapped to different size organizations and maturity. So if you want to learn kind of the lay of the land and which product is right for you, you can work with one of our sales reps to kind of narrow in on the type of tool that will be best for your needs. For those who have market pay, crowdsourced data is an add-on for that. So you can purchase it in addition to what the software already comes packed with. And for our customers of Insight and Insight Lab, crowdsourced data is already part of your product. So that's just a little tidbit on kind of how this data can be utilized by folks who are both customers and not customers. I also want to draw attention to some of the upcoming research that we have as an organization. Our compensation research team at Payscale is planning to release a new report on the impact of fair pay perception and its relationship to turnover. So I highly encourage you to check that out. We also have some really interesting webinars with some of our subject matter experts within our company here on talent retention strategies, manager training on pay communications, and other areas of compensation management that may be of interest to you. And finally, if you are an individual watching this and want to know what you are worth, please fill out a salary survey with Payscale. We would love to have your data added to our database and also to help you with your salary negotiations for your next job. If you like this content, we would love to know. It's a little bit of a new experiment for us. So please like or subscribe, leave us a comment, and let us know so we can make more content like this. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jackson.
Thank you.